While async validators are useful for validating input fields in place, sometimes we need to do validation upon submitting the form to the server. For example, imagine instead of a sign-up form here, we're building a login form. In this case, we need to submit both the username and password to the server in order to see if this is a valid login or not. We can't just validate the username or password in isolation. So let me show you how to add validation when submitting the form. Back in our template, first on the top, I'm going to handle the ng-submit event. Once again, to refresh your memory, we have this directive called ng-form that is applied to all form elements by default. And this event exposes an output property or an event called ng-submit. So we can use it in our event binding expressions. We can bind this event to, let's say, the login method in our component. Now back in the component, I'm going to add this method here, login. Now here we're going to call the server to see if this username and password is valid or not. Once again, we want to simplify things. So for now, don't worry about calling the server. But in the future, we're going to have a separate class called a service for talking to the server. Let's imagine the name of that class is auth service. So we'll have an object called auth service, and this would have a method like login. Here we need to pass the JSON object behind this form. So this.form.value. So this JSON object will have two properties, username and password. Now, when we call this login method, eventually we'll get a value from the server, most likely a Boolean, that determines if the user and password combination is valid or not. So imagine that code looks like this, is valid. Then we could write something like this, if is valid, is false. Now here we want to add the validation errors to the form, okay? So look, here we have this field called form of type form group. As you learned earlier, both the form group and form control classes derive from abstract control. So abstract control is the parent of these classes. It defines a set of common properties and methods that both these classes need. One of these methods is set errors. So here in our login method, we can call this.form.set errors. And with this, we can set errors at the form level. If you want to set errors at an individual control level, you should call this method on a particular form control object. For example, here we have this.username, which represents a form control object, and then we can call set errors. Now in this demo, we don't want to set the errors for the username field because we don't know which field is invalid. It could be the username or the password. So we want to set the errors at the form level. This.form.set errors. And here we add a validation errors object, just like when we implemented our custom validators. So an object, the keys represent the errors, in this case, invalid login, and the value could be a simple Boolean or a complex object with more details. Now to make this work, because currently we don't have this authentication service, I'm going to take this code out, delete this. So basically, whenever we submit the form, we're going to get this error no matter what. So let's add this semicolon here. Now back in the template, here above all the fields in this form, I'm going to add a div for displaying validation errors. So a div with two classes, alert and alert-danger. Tab. Now we want to add this only if our form has errors. So once again, we use ng-if form.errors. Now here we're dealing with only one kind of validation error. So we can add the validation message here. The username or password is invalid. But in your applications, if you have multiple specific errors, then here you would have multiple divs, each for a different kind of validation error, just like what we did for individual form control objects. Okay, so now let's test this. Back in the browser. So initially we don't have any errors, but when I click this, we get this validation error. The username or password is invalid.